phase of the operation as a little perplexing. But there were certain assumptions that President Putin adopted and imposed on his commanders that turned out to be invalid. And one of those was that we are moving into an area which is occupied by brother Slavs. And we want to minimize damage to the infrastructure. We don't want to kill civilians. We want to do as little damage, frankly, as possible. And so really a force too small for the job moved on multiple axes, I would say as many as 100, along a very, very long front of, say, 800 to 1,000 kilometers, and effectively infiltrated into Ukraine. And they met in many cases where there were Russians living with no resistance, but in areas where, of course, there were Ukrainians, they did meet resistance. And they were hamstrung as to how much they could do and how they could attack and so forth. Ultimately, they fight through this, and by the middle of the summer, it becomes clear that things cannot go on like this any longer. If they're going to bring an end to this, it's probably not going to come through negotiations, because their attempt to negotiate was thwarted in April and May, especially after they thought they were on the verge of having an agreement with Zelensky, who accepted neutrality for Ukraine and was willing to discuss the other issues, which included the autonomy for the Russian-speaking republics in the East and recognition of the legitimate control of Crimea by Russia. Of course, Crimea has been under Russian control essentially nonstop since the 1770s. So the bottom line is those things failed, and they decided, well, we've got to do something else. We've got to change our modus operandi. And of course, they saw at the same time the massive influx of aid from the United States and Western Europe. I think they were surprised at the extent to which the West European states in particular turned out to be, quote unquote, vassalized, that they would follow blindly without questioning anything, whatever came out of Washington. I don't think they expected that to happen in Berlin, where they've had really good relations with the Germans for at least the last 2 decades, I would argue for the last 3, and see them as long-term strategic partners, certainly in the commercial sense, but also in security matters. So they decided they're going to have to regroup and reorient the operation. So they secured the areas that you now see on the map, roughly 21% of the territory of Ukraine in the southeast. And they decided to consolidate that position. And quite frankly, holding this Kherson area was of questionable utility. There was no interest at this point in launching an offensive further west. They wanted to withdraw the forces there because those forces were, of course, at risk of being flooded by the destruction of the dam to the north of Kherson. They didn't want these troops to have to deal with this, and so they simply withdrew 30,000 men further west. And I think a lot of those troops are being rested right now and prepared for what comes in the future. And what is coming in the future is a very massive offensive, the kind of thing that, frankly, I and many other military analysts familiar with the Russians expected at the beginning, which are very decisive operations, multiple operational axes designed to effectively annihilate the enemy on the ground. And I think that's what's coming now. That's what lies in the future. We in the West have a bad habit of attaching far too much significance to, quote unquote, holding ground. This obviously began during the First World War. I don't think we've ever successfully divorced ourselves from it. The Russians do not view things through that lens. They have a very different history. They've been dealing with mobile armies, Mongolian, Tartar, Turkish, and they understand that ground is only valuable insofar as it provides you with a tactical advantage or an operational advantage. And usually that's fleeting. Remember, most of the terrain that we're dealing with in Ukraine is relatively open. It's not entirely flat, but it is certainly flatter than you're going to see in most other areas, except perhaps northern Germany. And this terrain has no particular value in most cases unless it helps you to kill the enemy. And so the Russians have looked to the north and to the south and said, this is terrain that is, quite frankly, not important. And there's nothing that we cannot retake again in the future. So when the so-called Kharkov offensive was launched, the Russians had run what we call an economy of force operation up in the north, essentially 2,000 men along a very wide front, designed to create the impression that there was something there, but in reality, there really wasn't anything behind them. And so when the Ukrainians attacked, the Russians said, well, we're not going to sacrifice these men in a pointless struggle, so we're going to get out of the way and fall back to the river, which is what they did, the last natural barrier that the Ukrainians could not easily cross. And in the meantime, they've done what they have tried to do from the very beginning, which is maximize the use of what I call the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance connectivity to strike systems being standoff attack, whether it comes in the form of rockets, drones, missiles, aircraft, or conventional artillery. So the Ukrainians, they had about 30 to 40,000 men in this attack, lost 40% of their force just moving across this open ground. And for the last several months, once the decision was made to move over to the strategic defensive and defend these areas that have now been formally annexed into Russia, they were able to inflict enormous damage on the Ukrainians. There are over 100,000 dead Ukrainian troops now. There are at least 2, 3, 400,000 wounded. We don't even know. Your more complex systems like HIMARS, the much celebrated high mobility rocket system that we provided, are operated exclusively by American and British contractors. Ukrainians aren't operating them. Many of the systems that we've provided to the Ukrainians take months for people to master. For instance, on the HIMARS system, just the driver, and they normally have only 2 people that are on a HIMARS system. The driver, who is part of the team of 2 that operates it, has 1,100 tasks to perform quickly before a rocket is even launched. And he has to know those tasks. He has to learn them. So this is not your grandfather's artillery or your great-grandfather's artillery from the Second World War. As a result, I think the Ukrainians have expended themselves needlessly against increasingly difficult defenses. And we have covered, these minor tactical advances of 10 or 20 kilometers and said, look, the Ukrainians are winning. Well, what happened was the Russian commander said, there's no point in defending the line we were given. We're going to fall back to the next defensible position. And in the meantime, we'll set up what the Russians call a fire trap, where you take the ISR assets that are overhead and you link them to the strike assets, and then you annihilate everything that follows you. This is a revolution in warfare. And the Russians were the first to figure this out in the 1970s. My last book, I covered it in great detail, trying to explain to people that this near instantaneous link between the standoff attack systems that I mentioned earlier in artillery to overhead and terrestrial-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets spells disaster and annihilation for anybody that moves within range. And that's what's happened to the Ukrainians. So the Russians have taken far, far fewer casualties. About 3 or 4 months ago, for every 1 Russian casualty, there were 5 Ukrainian. Over the last 90 days, it's moved up to about 1 to 8 or 1 to 10. So this has simply bled the Ukrainians in these pointless counterattacks while the Russians have fallen back, consolidated their position, and begun the process that you mentioned earlier of integrating the new 300,000 reservists, fleshing out their forces. Excuse me. And remember that the Russians never employed more than 20% of their own ground force. Well, now we're looking at about 80% of their ground force, plus these reservists. So you have, perhaps in the theater itself, all the way around Ukraine now, down in the south and in Western Russia and Belarus, a total of perhaps 700,000 men in the Air Force and the ground forces, support and combat, and probably 250,000 to 300,000 combat troops. That is what is now massed. And the idea is to finish this campaign, put an end to it, and put this Ukrainian state out of business, simply because they've discovered we will not negotiate and we will not stop supplying Ukraine. Simply prevailed upon the French and Germans to do nothing. And so there was no attempt on our part to fulfill what we agreed to do in the Minsk Accords. But this is very important now, what I'm about to say, because this illustrates very clearly, in my judgment, where we are. The current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, and he has a habit of doing these things, which is reprehensible, but nevertheless, he's the senior military advisor to the President of the United States. He was also the senior advisor for the last 2 years of the Trump administration. And when things do not suit him, or when he is trying to present himself in a more positive manner, he has the bad habit of leaking information from private conversations with the president and his advisors. He did that. And on Saturday, the New York Times printed his leak. He literally picks up the phone and talks to someone at the New York Times. But what he said is very, very, very instructive. And what he said was the following. I advised the president that the Ukrainians had done about as much as they reasonably could do. That was the first part. And I urged him to bring pressure on Kiev to negotiate with Moscow. Now, those are 2 important statements. The first is very true. The Ukrainians are in bad shape. They're not prepared for what's coming. He knows that. We have excellent intelligence. We know the forces that are massing. We know how they're equipped, and they're not equipped as the forces were that first went into eastern Ukraine. They have the most modern weaponry available. The Russians have now repeatedly at night demonstrated their ability to target precisely energy, fuel, transportation, and so forth. He knows that the Ukrainians are running out of those things. It won't be long before they run out of food. It won't be long before they're freezing. He knows the serious weakness that characterize Ukrainian forces. So he is saying they have done all that we can reasonably expect them to do. Secondly, it's time to negotiate. This is a good time before the offensive that I have been describing begins, because I think he knows that once that begins, that there will be no further discussion under any circumstances between Moscow and Kiev or us until it is over to the satisfaction of the Russians. So I think he sent a very clear and very important signal. I'm not sure he intended to do that, but he did. And I think he's also trying to position himself as saying in the future, well, I warned them that they should negotiate. I warned the president that this would happen. This is his behavior pattern. But I think he has inadvertently revealed the truth. And that truth is that this is a good time for the Ukrainians to come to the negotiating table. They're not going to get what they would have gotten 2 months ago. But we should really end this war, because the longer this lasts, the higher the probability that we may end up in a direct confrontation with the Russians. Well, let's look first at Europe. And most important in Europe is Germany. Germany is the powerhouse. Germany is the preeminent power, regional power in Europe. And Germany's economy is expected to contract 20 to 30% as a result of the sanctions that have been imposed and the lack of access to natural gas and oil from Russia. That's a disaster. You're talking about practically the deindustrialization of Germany. Now, for Europeans that don't like Germany, that may seem like a good thing. It's not, because Germany really boosts the economies of the rest of the continent. And if Germany goes down that path, and I think that's where they're headed right now, it's going to be very bad for Europe at large. Now, the Italians have already said they don't want to send any more aid unless it's humanitarian. The latest polls that I saw over the weekend suggested that roughly 40% of the German electorate has now finally reached the conclusion that their government and media are not telling them the truth. They're beginning to see that what the Russians have said and what the Russians are doing is different from what they've been told. I think that is the beginning of the end of the current coalition in Berlin. In addition to that, I think there are others in Sweden and Denmark and the Netherlands and France who are beginning to question. That's certainly the case in Austria, even though Austria is not in NATO. I said from the very beginning that I thought that if this lasted for more than 6 months, it might very well destroy NATO. Because let's be frank, the national interests of people that live in Sweden or Finland are not the same as the national interests of the people that live in Spain and Italy. All alliances are difficult to hold together in war. Trying to hold a real military alliance together in what has been peacetime is enormously difficult. And the principal reason for the last decades or so has been that, well, this is another way to reach Washington, the NATO system. This is another way to acquire money and support, influence, and so forth. Remember, every small power has an interest in exploiting the larger power in pursuit of its own interests. We have multiple small powers doing that sort of thing. But I think what has really been exposed more than anything else is that Europe consists of a large number of military dependencies. They're not independent, sovereign states. I was on the phone recently with some French colleagues, because I'm sure most of your viewers know that I served at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, and I spent many years serving in U.S. forces in Germany before I went to Mons. And I know a lot of senior officers who are now retired that I served with back in 1997, 98, 99, and 2000. And they've been very blunt. They've said, Doug, the French army has 4 days of ammunition. The French army is prepared to go on safari in North Africa, and that's it. The German army is almost non-existent. So where is this great coalition of the willing coming from that was discussed recently in the media in the United States? A multinational task force that could conceivably enter Ukraine based upon what General Retired Petraeus said. Well, it consists of perhaps 40, 50,000 U.S. troops, 30,000 Polish troops, 20,000 Romanians. And this multinational force would at some point potentially stagger into Western Ukraine. When and how and under what circumstances, I have no idea, but the idea is absurd. The Russians are firing 20,000 rounds of artillery every day. The Ukrainians have been firing 7,000 trying to keep up. This is something Europe has not seen, and by the way, neither has the United States in a very long time. It's called a real war against a real enemy, an organized force. NATO was designed to defend, not to wage offensive warfare. We, since the 1990s, have been trying to turn NATO into an offensive instrument. We tried to use it that way in the Balkans, and were somewhat successful in our conduct of those operations, though I think the outcome is a very questionable long-term strategic viability, as we're finding out. But we've also tried to drag Europe with us into the Middle East, into Libya, into North Africa. We